Um, so it seems odd to be explaining the NIHR and the infrastructure 10 years after it was initially established, but it still appears to be the NHS's best kept secret. And John will know very well that we were surprised by many of the investigators who were leading stratified medicine studies weren't aware that the Clinical Research Network existed and was there precisely to help them deliver their studies. So the NIHR is funded to the tune of £1 billion a year by the Department of Health, and its aim is to improve both the health and the wealth of England through clinical research. There are analogous entities that are also active in the devolved nations, and I think it's fair to say that it does provide a world-leading infrastructure for health research, and it operates in what, despite what many of us feel on a day-to-day basis, the most integrated health research and delivery system in the world. And it's essentially the research arm of the National Health Service. It carries out research in the NHS, for the NHS, and for the benefit of NHS patients. So the Clinical Research Network is £300 million a year that drives the engine of delivery of clinical research, clinical trials, but also a rich array of other types of studies. And it sits in the middle of the pathway that the NIHR supports, from discovery research and early phase in biomedical research centres. And I think many of us, when the Stratified Medicine programme was launched by the MRC, imagined that many of the studies, much of the research was going to be done exclusively in BRCs, and I'll show you in a minute that that's not at all the case. Operates the clinical research facilities across the country, the ECMCs, the Experimental Cancer Medicine Centres, the HTCs and the DECs that you've already heard about. And the NIHR is also involved in implementation through the CLARCs, the Collaboration for Leadership in Applied Health Research and Care. I'm glad it's written there because I can never remember what CLARC stands for when it's as an acronym. So there's £300 million being spent to support clinical research in the NHS. And it sits to basically to deliver the research, the evidence base that will drive innovation into implementation. It's a very rich resource. Michael has mentioned that we have a number of specialty clusters across universities in England, and we have key opinion leaders in 42 separate clinical specialties and research domains, including primary care, health services research, public health, but also all the acute specialties. And we have a network of around 500 leaders in each of those specialties across the country, who are there to help with the analysing the feasibility and the possibility of delivering research to time and target in all the NHS organisations across the country. So having that rich resource of people who really know their specialties, but also know the research capabilities of organisations across the country, is an enormously valuable resource for investigators, but also for research funders, including the commercial sector. As well as those clinical leaders, we also support over 10,000 staff in the NHS to deliver research. So this is unrivaled in the world, I think it's fair to say. And we support both commercial and academic research, and we're there at every stage of the journey of those clinical studies. And it's a high volume activity too. So each year around 1,800 new studies are adopted onto the portfolio and open across the country. About a third of those are commercial. We're very much open for business as UK PLC, and getting on for around 1,200 academic studies open each year. So there's a lot of work to do, but there are a lot of people that we support in order to be able to deliver those studies. The number of patients recruited is going up generally year on year, particularly for commercial studies. Nearly 150,000 patients have been recruited to commercial studies over the last 6 years, and around 34,000 just in the last year, to around 600 new studies each year. So this is, we don't want to be UK's Department of Health's best kept secret. We really want the industry to use us in order to benefit the NHS and its patients. And overall, around 600,000 patients are recruited each year into portfolio studies. So it's nearly 3.5 million people over the last 6 years. I still find that absolutely astonishing. I mean, more patients are recruited to these studies than read newspapers nowadays. It's just a great achievement, I think. But it's also, as well as those patients benefiting from participation in research, also if they spend time with the study team, and it's a great opportunity for health education and all the other benefits that come from working with research active, research aware clinical teams. So I mentioned that we'd anticipated that the early phase work was likely to be in BRCs. Actually, a substantial proportion of the portfolio is actually now early phase studies. So around 300, 350 studies currently are early phase work, phase 1, first in man, phase 1-2, phase 2, as well as a good proportion of post-licensing studies that answer important questions for both commercial organisations but also for commissioners. I mentioned that we're there at every step of the journey, and this is really important, not only for experienced and established investigators, but also for new investigators. We've been operating for 10 years now, and we are supporting studies in every single NHS organisation in the country, which you can imagine that was quite a challenge for some of those organisations. This is the commercial break. So we're there to help with feasibility, to ask people who really know their subject, know their sites, about the potential for delivery, to advise on patient numbers, advise on eligibility criteria for individual studies, and also to help identify sites, both existing and new sites. We have a universal commercial costing template, so that means that's cut out a lot of the delays that traditionally happened with commercial studies, wrangling with individual NHS trusts about costs. That's real lubricant in the system to be able to offer that, and it's not just for acute trusts but also for primary care settings and also for, more recently, for device research. We're also there to help with gaining approvals through the Health Research Authority to gain NHS permissions in individual organisations. We used to be entirely responsible for it, for local sites. Now the universal sites are through the Health Research Authority, which is gearing up to deliver even increased performance. And we're there to help with model agreements that enable multinational studies to operate in the UK without a lot of delay. And then, importantly, the network is there to help manage studies, and that's through the management of individual study teams, but also collecting and sharing data and actively managing the performance of those studies. We're active in every single NHS organisation, from University College Hospital through to Barking and Dagenham PCT, as was. So a huge opportunity for studies of all different types. And of those organisations, nearly 3/4 are actively involved in commercial contract studies. Again, very different picture to 10 years ago, where particularly in primary care settings, many GDHs, we're not really open for business for industry studies. But if we're going to make progress, if we're going to deliver innovation and have them implemented, it's absolutely essential that we do them in real-world settings that persuade commissioners that this is going to be work for patients wherever they are. To get studies open in the UK now, the median is 20 days. I'll show you what it used to be before the networks really got started. And we are world leaders in our ability to deliver studies. Last year, we recruited 17 global firsts and 10 European firsts to studies, which is a very important statistic. Not only can you get the study open, but you can find your first patient very quickly in England. So just to set this in context, so 20 days might sound like a long time to get a piece of paper signed. Actually, if you look back just 5 years ago, it was taking getting on for 120 days, and these are just the median. So you can imagine what the maximum was. Some of them are still probably waiting in the ether to get signed, but this is internationally competitive, and that's due to the professionalism of our workforce and other components of the system in the HRA and other elements. So if you look at so this is an analysis, I think, of 68 countries across the world, data provided by a globally active contract research organisation. The fastest at that time was 13 weeks. The UK was 28 weeks to get the first site initiated after the final protocol and informed consent form made available. Pretty impressive. And is attracting more and more business, but also delivering the same service to academic studies too. 10,000 research staff trained to good clinical practice across the investigator, there to support investigators. I know many of investigators feel the system's not there to help them, and that R&D departments are essentially the nightclub bouncers rather than the concierges of clinical research in the NHS. But we are there to deliver research, and we're determined to make that happen. Not only with patient identification, the recruitment, the screening actually is a very important element of what we now do for stratified medicine studies. And that will influence, I think, our discussions this afternoon when we talk about how the clinical research network needs to evolve with the evolution of stratified and precision medicine studies, but also to deliver those studies, including the follow-up of those patients. And that's becoming increasingly complex as studies become increasingly complex. And we offer GCP training free to anybody who's working on a portfolio clinical trial. The network's there to support innovation and actually to deliver the evidence base for implementation. So just a few examples to demonstrate the spectrum of the kind of work that the clinical research network's involved, which you might have imagined that studies such as this one, which was a bionic eye study in extremely deeply phenotyped individuals, would be in a BRC, in a very specialist environment. This was supported by the network. And the first patient was 80 years old, and he had his bionic eye implanted and restored at least his central vision. And that was a global first patient for that study. So very much in the experimental medicine space, as well as later studies such as this one, which was the largest ever ophthalmology study in the world. The target was 30,000 patients for post-licensing long-term safety and effectiveness studies of Lucentis for all its licensed indications. Over a third of the global patients were recruited in this country. And the top 2 sites in the world were supported by the network in England. So I just want to turn to a couple of stratified medicine exemplars. John mentioned hepatitis C as an area that we've we've made great progress in the UK. If you look back 7 or 8 years, essentially wasn't any trial activity going on in hepatitis C, and the studies that were in the US, as you might imagine, but in New Zealand. I don't know why that's surprising, but it was to me. And actually, in the pivotal studies of what is now recognised to be an effective agent, Europe wasn't involved at all. But thanks to NIHR and MRC, and actually the Medical Research Foundation, the MRC's charity, which supported the hepatitis C cohort, the biobank, that has been transformed. And actually, the UK was central to what has now become the licensing and implementation of curative therapy in hepatitis C. John mentioned the Stratified Medicine grant that went to the consortium led by Ellie Barnes. That enabled the resource, the patient population, deeply phenotyped population, to deliver 2 studies, BOSON, which I'm going to talk a little bit about, and Astral 3, that was both led and delivered in this country. So the BOSON trial was nearly 600 patients looking at sofosbuvir in combination with ribavirin in patients with a variety of types of hepatitis C, but crucially in genotype 3, which is the most aggressive and serious form of hepatitis, and essentially a death sentence for patients who suffer with that. And this study showed that not only was it possible to eliminate the virus, so this SVR12 is the freedom from recognizable virus in circulation at 12 weeks after therapy. That's a single cycle of therapy. That not only was that possible in patients who've not yet developed cirrhosis, but in getting on for 90% of patients who had advanced disease cirrhosis, and even if they'd received and failed other forms of therapy. And this has led to NICE approval of this agent, a major achievement for genotype 3 unequivocally. But also this agent is also effective in other genotypes, but this is the most at-need group, and to have delivered the evidence base that has essentially stratified a population that commissioners now recognise is really important, and the NIHR was there at every step of the journey. That was a Gilead-sponsored study. We were the second of 5 countries who started that and actually recruited more patients than anywhere else, and again, top 2 recruiting sites globally. So finally, just to talk about cancer, I mean, the targeting immune checkpoints is everywhere at the moment. It's a fantastic success story for this disease, and you don't need to know much about the biology, but a key pathway is the programmed death receptor, PD-1, which interacts with a ligand, and essentially this creates an environment in which tumours can grow and evade the immune system. The development of antibodies against various components of this system has been one of the major breakthroughs of the last decade, and one of those has been used in a study that was led by an investigator at my host institution at Barts Hospital. It was a Roche agent that was used in advanced bladder cancer, an incurable, aggressive, unpleasant disease for which there is, up until this agent, essentially no effective therapy. It was targeted against the PD-L1, the ligand, and importantly, in this study, the presence of that target was identified by an immunohistochemistry analysis, so a molecular pathology tool, and green is lots of the target and red is none of it, and this waterfall plot shows how much shrinkage you got of the tumour volume after therapy. And in the context of this disease where the response rate to conventional chemotherapy is around 10%, you can see about 50% of the patients responded, and some of them had very, very significant tumour shrinkage. And when you look at overall survival, stratified on the basis of the presence of the target or not, you can see that those who had lots of the target did much better than those who had little. So really important to stratify patients to be able to achieve good outcomes in those who've got the target. Very good for the company, because this study was considered pivotal, and the FDA licensed this agent on the basis of this study for advanced bladder cancer. And agents of this kind are now becoming used in many other types of solid malignancy, which are resistant to conventional forms of therapy. That stratification on the basis of the presence of ligand in more than 50% of the target cell population was really important for the company too, because it's a linked diagnostic. If you don't get it right, it can be very, very bad news for a company. So Bristol Myers Squibb, with a similar agent, lost in a single day $35 billion of its capital because they didn't stratify properly. They used a similar tool, but stratified with an inappropriate level of the presence of the target. So an agent that might have advanced if the stratification had been appropriate failed, to, I'm sure, embarrassment for those involved. And so absolutely fundamental to the success of this type of targeted agents is the integration of molecular pathology in order to be able to be precise about giving the right medicine to the right patient at the right time. So just a word about why the network is good, not only for patients and for research funders, but it's also good for the organizations in which we work, because it's anecdotal that we think that patients in clinical trials just do better, and therefore it's a good thing to do research. Actually, now there's hard evidence for that from a study that was led by Matt Seymour and Peter Selby, just published 2 weeks ago, in Gut, that showed for organizations that were involved in clinical research in colorectal cancer for more than 3 years, achieved substantially better outcomes for all of the patients managed by that organization for that type of disease. So it's not only good for research funders, for patients, but it's also good for the NHS. And that, I think, is a very important impact too. So just to finish yet, so I think research is important to those organizations too, because we've historically, and commissioners have often used the evidence base of research done elsewhere in order to commission something and to enable organizations to treat others with the same trial condition. But actually, if your clinical team is involved in research, they also get used to understanding why drug B is better than drug A, and also able to design studies that look at drugs at C and D, device C and D. And the presence of trial participants is good for all of the patients in the organization. And it also starts to help patients understand why research is important, and it's going to be increasingly important, I think, in the era of stratified medicine, where we're going to be screening a lot of patients who actually turn out not to be suitable for the study in which they thought they were going to be a participant. And that message, I think, is going to be difficult to transmit, and it needs research-aware, research-integrated personnel in the clinical teams in order to be able to do that. So the UK is open for clinical research. The network is there to help investigators, and do use those links to learn more about the network. Thank you very much.